Hi everyone, this is Leah with Headwater Science Institute. Welcome to another edition of Lunch with a Scientist, your opportunity to meet a brilliant STEM professional. Today, we are excited to present Kerri Spuller. Kerri graduated with her MS in Geosciences from Boise State University with a focus in geomorphology and landscape change. And we're going to learn what geomorphology is today. For her research, she used geochronology and geochemistry to understand how drylands have been influenced by climate change over glacial-interglacial cycles. And currently, she works as a geotechnical consultant in northern Nevada. And outside of this, she likes to backpack, mountain bike, meet new people, and explore new places. Hi, Kerri. How are you?
Good, Leah. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for being here today. We're so excited to hear you talk a little bit more about landscapes and your research, and I will let you take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. So I'm a geomorphologist, which means that I'm a geologist that studies how landscapes are formed. Today, I'm going to be talking about what geomorphology is, how it can be used to read landscapes, why it's useful, and give some research examples. First, I want to start out by talking about the photo on this slide. So I didn't just pick this picture because it's a pretty...
Let's stop real quick. It seems like StreamYard is frozen.
Okay.
Can you try to move forward in the slideshow?
Oops, sorry.
Yeah, we're stuck.
Oh, yeah.
Usually that's just StreamYard hasn't caught up with itself. So can you just exit the screen share and pull it in again?
Yeah.
I should have asked you in the beginning to scroll to the next slide. Sometimes it just doesn't catch up with itself. All right. Let's try that.
Oh, I didn't do presenter view, maybe. Well, I didn't change anything.
And you're showing that you're on the next slide on your computer?
No, it's not. Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. I will close, maybe I'll close.
Yeah, maybe it's that.
Invitation. And then stop. Screen share and then reopen it.
I will say there was this really weird instance the other day where for the first time we couldn't really get anything to move forward in its share. StreamYard was just for some reason glitching out, so we actually had to reschedule. So we'll give yours a try, and then if we can't get it going, I'll pull in something on my end too and see if it really is just totally frozen. All right.
Okay. Yeah, it's not. There's another. Oh, yeah, it's not even. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. I was pressing the plus, but I guess that's the zoom. I don't know. That's weird.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
okay. I'll just use the keyboard to do it, I guess. Okay. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. No worries at all. Okay, we're good?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Okay. Awesome. I'll cut this off anyways with my video editor, so we'll just keep going. Let me take it out. Good morning, Kerri. How are you?
Good. How are you, Leah?
I'm great, thank you. We're so excited to have you, hear more about your research involving landscapes, and I'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm a geomorphologist, which means that I'm a geologist that studies how landscapes are formed. Today I'm going to be talking about what geomorphology is, how it can be used to read landscapes, why it's useful, and then give some research examples. So first, I'd like to start about talking about the photo on this slide. So I didn't only pick this picture because it's a pretty background. As a geomorphologist, I look at this photo and I see a lot of different information. I can see in the foreground that the ground is covered in mud cracks. It's dry right now, but this is a depression or low point in the landscape where water collects. The soil here is made up of really fine-grained sediments. As I move back into the photo, the ground changes in the distance and looks more rocky. I can see alluvial fans spilling sediment down from the canyons in the mountains. I can also see that the mountains in the distance look like they've been eroded. You can see these drainage systems carved into them. So just in this photo, we can learn a lot of different things about this environment. So have you ever seen a really amazing landscape and wondered, how did this form? Well, this is kind of the main question behind geomorphology. When I use the word landscape, I'm referring to landforms on Earth's surface, which are made up of rocks, sediment, soil, water features, as well as the vegetation on top of them. Here's an example of the Badlands in New Mexico. Badlands are made up of sediments left behind by lakes that existed in the past under cooler and wetter conditions than today. As the lakes dried up, they left behind sediments that can erode into interesting features. So even though the lakes aren't here now, we can tell that they existed by the sediments that they left behind. So here's a picture of a hanging valley. Hanging valleys are formed when one glacial valley is truncated by another glacial valley. So while there aren't any glaciers in this picture, we can see from the formations that there were once huge glaciers carving out these valleys. And so as you can see, landscapes don't only tell us about things that are happening right now, they also preserve records of the past. So now that we're thinking about landscapes, here's an outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. First, I'll give a brief overview of what geomorphology is, what types of tools geomorphologists use to study landscapes, and talk about some different career paths for geomorphologists. Then I'll talk about some specific research questions that geomorphologists are interested in and go over a few examples of research and some applied work that I've done throughout my career. So geomorphology is kind of a weird word, but if we break it down into its root words, geo means earth, morph means change, and adding ology at the end just means that's the study of something. So geomorphology is the study of the processes that shape Earth's surface. So what types of processes shape Earth? Examples include some of the pictures that we see here, like water, wind, landslides, volcanic activity, glaciers, as well as earthquakes and tectonics. These are all different types of erosion. So the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Different types of geologists can study different parts of the geologic timescale. Compared to other geologists, geomorphologists are generally interested in the most recent part, so things that have shaped the Earth's landscape the way we see them that they are today. So what are some tools that geomorphologists use? A lot of geomorphologists spend time outside in the field. So a shovel definitely comes in handy along with a field notebook, a map, and good observation skills. We also take a lot of measurements. So depending on what you're interested in, you might be collecting data with a stream flow meter or a wind speed meter, or collecting samples to take back to the lab. Here's some pictures of some field work that I've done. In the one on the left, I'm mapping stratigraphy of sediments in the deserts of southern Utah. And the one on the right, I'm collecting tree cores from the rainforests in the Pacific Northwest. So in the lab, geomorphologists use a variety of different dating techniques to figure out how old a landform is. Examples include dendrochronology, which is the study of tree rings that can be used to date landforms and understand past changes in climate. So on the left, you can see an example of a 500-year-old tree that captured evidence of a mega drought in the 16th century. On the right, there's a picture of a radiocarbon dating lab. In these labs, we use carbon isotopes to date organics preserved in sediments. Other techniques include luminescence dating, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more later, and cosmogenic isotopes, which can be used to calculate erosion rates to understand the timing, frequency, and magnitude of past erosion events. Geomorphologists might also be interested in analyzing the composition of soil, sediment, water, air, or even glacial ice. So since geomorphologists are interested in landscape scale studies, things like GIS, remote sensing, satellite imagery, and GPS are all really important tools. Drones are really useful to collect high-resolution aerial imagery. Most geomorphologists will use a combination of many of these tools to characterize and interpret a landscape. So you can tell from this list of tools that there are a lot of different disciplines involved in geomorphology. Geomorphology uses principles from geology, geography, hydrology, ecology, soil science, even archaeology, as well as engineering, physics, chemistry, and math. It can be used to integrate these different fields to answer a lot of different questions. So something that I really like about geomorphology is that it's an interdisciplinary science. And by combining aspects of different physical sciences, we're able to make predictions about global change and then inform environmental policy and management decisions. So where do geomorphologists work? We can wear a lot of different hats and titles. For example, people with backgrounds in geomorphology might work in geologic hazards, remediation, river or habitat restoration. These jobs could be in the public sector for different federal or state agencies, like the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Geological Survey, the EPA, or even NASA. They could work for the private sector, like environmental and geotechnical consulting firms, or they could be researchers at universities or research institutions. Throughout my career, I've had a lot of different opportunities to work in a variety of these different career paths. I worked in the private sector for environmental and geotechnical consulting firms, for the federal government, and for a collaborative nonprofit watershed group. So now we'll talk about some of the types of questions that geomorphologists are interested in trying to answer. So geomorphologists are definitely interested in understanding the past. Questions like, when did these mountains form and how did these canyons form help us characterize how and when a landscape was formed. We can also look at climate records to understand how landscapes responded to past changes in climate. For example, under what type of climate conditions did the bristlecone pines, one of the oldest living trees on Earth, start growing? Or we can use landscape records to understand past civilizations, like how did landscape change affect the movement of early humans in North America? A basic principle of geology is that the past is key to the present. This means that the same principles that shaped the Earth in the past still apply today. Geomorphology learns from the records stored in landscapes to understand things that are happening now or that could happen in the future. An important part of geomorphology is understanding geologic hazards and how they might affect people, communities, ecosystems, and environments. For example, is this a good place to build a house or is it in a floodplain? What major highways are most prone to landslides? If a volcano erupts, where will the lava flow? We can also look even farther into the future and ask things like, how will rising sea levels under predicted climate conditions affect communities located on the coast? And so even though geomorphology is focused on Earth, I think it's worth mentioning that we can also apply these same concepts to other planets. Comparative geomorphology uses satellites to identify features in other planets in order to understand what processes may have shaped their surface. We can use landforms and surface processes on Earth to understand other planets like Mars. Most of you have probably heard in the news about the Mars rover Perseverance that landed on Mars in February, and it's going to spend the next 2 years exploring its surface. Right now, the rover is showing us high-resolution imagery of landforms and surface features. It also has some instruments that can analyze rock and soil composition and it's actually collecting some samples that could eventually be returned to Earth. There's evidence from surface features on Mars that it may have been a wet planet billions of years ago and may have even supported microbial life. Because of its similarities to Earth, understanding Mars's past might help us understand Earth's fate and even find ways to geoengineer solutions to help our planet. So now I'm going to give two specific research examples. The first one is a really great example of how interdisciplinary science like geomorphology can be really useful for answering a variety of different questions. Okay, so the first example we'll talk about explores the evolution of North American salmon. So on the west coast of North America, there are 5 unique species of salmon, but in the east, there's only one species, the Atlantic salmon. So for a long time, scientists didn't know why Western salmon would have diverged into these 5 unique species, while the Atlantic salmon remained the same over that same period of time. So in 2000, a geomorphologist from the University of Washington, Dave Montgomery, looked at this question through an interdisciplinary lens. So Montgomery knew that the topography of the eastern United States is made up of the Appalachian Mountains, a really old mountain chain that formed from about 500 to 200 million years ago, and for the past 70 million years has seen very little tectonic activity. You can see in the picture of the Appalachians on the right that these are really old mountains. They're really rounded and they're totally covered in vegetation. Meanwhile, the picture on the left shows mountains on the west coast, which are much younger and have these huge jagged peaks. Tectonic activity over the past 30 million years along the Pacific Rim has resulted in these rising coastal mountains all along the west coast, from California all the way up to Alaska. So Montgomery hypothesized that these topographic changes physically isolated subsets of salmon, which over time resulted in 5 different species of Pacific salmon. To test this hypothesis, he compared the timing of salmon speciation in the West to geological activity. He found that the timing of the emergence of the 5 species of Pacific salmon corresponds to the period of uplift in mountain building in the same regions. So while the eastern salmon have enjoyed pretty consistent conditions throughout their existence, the western salmon have witnessed huge changes in topography due to tectonic activity. So we can see from this example that using this whole systems approach in integrating ecology and geology, we're able to see the big picture. So 2 species of Pacific salmon are endangered. Understanding how these species are tied to their local geography is really important to being able to manage and preserve these species. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about the research that I did during my master's at Boise State University. So we know that the climate is changing and that many landscapes and ecosystems around the world are really sensitive to these changes. So the main question driving my research is, how does climate change influence landscapes? As you can imagine, there's a lot of different ways that we can address this question. I'm going to show you how I used ancient sand grains to recreate past landscapes. Okay, so first let's talk about Earth's climate. This graph shows average global temperature over the past 1 million years. In the past, Earth's climate has fluctuated between much colder as well as much warmer climates compared to today. Many landscapes we see today were influenced by these changes in climate. So for my research, I wanted to understand how climate change influenced sand dune formation in the southwestern United States. I conducted my fieldwork in the coral pink sand dunes in southern Utah. So to a geologist, dunes are more than just piles of sand. They're also useful indicators of past climate change. You might think of sand dunes as mobile, transient features, but dune fields can actually store really long records of past dune activity. I chose the coral pink sand dunes as my study site because the dune field is located up against the base of these cliffs that act as a topographic barrier that can trap sediments. So first I went out with a shovel and a notebook and mapped the stratigraphy of the sediments along the base of the cliffs. I found that rock falls and debris flows from the top of the cliffs have capped and preserved wind-blown deposits. Next, I looked at the geochemistry of the sediment. The coral pink sand dune samples are plotted in blue, and a nearby dune field located about 6 miles away is plotted in red. These two dune fields cluster into two distinct groups based on differences in relative abundance of trace elements. Differences in dune geochemistry indicate that these dune fields are likely derived from different sources. So therefore, rather than being really far traveled, the sediments that make up these dune fields likely came from local sources and didn't travel very far. So here's another graph comparing the coral pink sand dunes to other dune fields across the southwestern United States, showing some overlap, but also really distinct differences between all of these different dune fields. So using geochemical indicators, we can see that each of these dune fields has kind of a unique fingerprint that gives clues about where the sediments might have been derived from. I also use luminescence dating to tell me when these dunes have been active in the past. So luminescence dating dates the last time that sand grains were exposed to sunlight, allowing me to determine when the sand was deposited. My results show that this dune field has been active as far back as 150,000 years ago. These ancient sand grains have an interesting story to tell us about past landscape change. So when we compare the timing of dune activity along the top here to regional climate records, we see that rather than just occurring under hot, dry, desert-like conditions, in the past, dune activity actually occurred under wetter, cooler, and in general, more variable climate conditions. During these times, there were huge amounts of sediment being carried by rivers and streams that could serve as sediment sources for these local dune field systems. Tying these results in with the geochemical tracers I used, I concluded that these dune fields formed in response to increased sediment loads in nearby streams. So in addition to learning about dune activity, these records also tell us about past changes in hydrology, stream systems, and sediment load. So today we've spent a lot of time talking about things like climate and plate tectonics influence the Earth's surface. But I want to say that humans can also have a huge impact on landscapes. Things like cities and development, agriculture, and mining can all have really big influences on our landscapes. So now I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about some work that I've done throughout my career. I've done river and habitat restoration in urban watersheds in Buffalo, New York, where I grew up. I've also worked on remediating abandoned mine lands with a watershed group in Leadville, Colorado. So here's a picture of me doing some maintenance on retention basins that capture acid mine drainage from abandoned mines. By capturing the acid mine drainage, we can keep it from entering into water systems downstream and preserve those waters and the habitats. I've also been able to do fieldwork in some really beautiful places, like measuring spring snowmelt from 14,000-foot mountains in Colorado. I've also worked on projects with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, doing habitat restoration and monitoring fish populations. I worked on projects with the U.S. Forest Service, delineating high elevation fen wetlands in the backcountry. In addition to fieldwork, I've also done a lot of different types of lab work throughout my career. So here's a picture of me analyzing water quality samples from streams impacted by acid mine drainage. I've also done a lot of teaching, STEM outreach, and outdoor education. And so even though I'm not a teacher, I think it's really important for scientists of all backgrounds to be able to communicate their research and to be able to work with land managers, decision makers, and the general public to inform them about the types of work that they do and why it's important. So in summary, some of the key points that we talked about today are that geomorphology is the study of processes that shape the Earth's surface. It's an interdisciplinary science that can be used to integrate different fields to answer a lot of different questions. The past is the key to the present, and this means that the records stored in landscapes can be used to understand things that are happening now or that could happen in the future. And so one big takeaway from today is that landscapes can hold clues that can help us understand and prepare for and maybe even mitigate future changes. For example, we're seeing some of the effects of anthropogenic climate change on landscapes today. Integrating different physical sciences into land use management policies is really critical to understanding where we live and what we can do to adapt to future changes. Okay, and that's all I have for you today. Thank you, Headwater, so much for having me, and to all the students who viewed this presentation, I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Kerri.
Thanks.
It was great. I think it's really fascinating that your work is so interdisciplinary and uses all these different areas of science to study a lot of different things. And so I wanted to kind of dig into that concept. First off, you shared that as part of your work, you have looked at how topography has influenced species populations. Gave us a really good example of the salmon. And I wonder if you could give us any other examples of how topography has influenced species populations over the years.
Oh man, yeah, so that's like an interesting question. So that example is just like, well, kind of one of my, was like kind of, one of the first examples I learned like in a geomorphology class as an undergrad. I thought it was just so interesting that this geomorphologist, like, he didn't do any new research for that study. He just did a review of existing research. He was reading through some like ecology research, seeing like people wondering, hypothesizing different things for why the salmon could be different. And none of them really answered. None of them were specific to the East versus the West Coast. All the hypotheses kind of applied to both of them. And so as a geomorphologist, he was just like, hey, I know that these things happen. And so he just went through and compared the dates of the tectonic activity to the speciation events, and drew that conclusion just through a review of existing literature. So he was able to just tie those two different things together. I'm sure there's lots of other examples, and I don't know of any off the top of my head, but I just think that was like a really awesome, I just remember that being a really interesting example, and something that really drew me to geomorphology, of being able to step back and see the big picture and tie all these different sciences together.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. You wouldn't necessarily look in a creek and wonder if there's more or less fish because of the development of the land, but it really does connect those concepts.
Yeah.
So moving on to another area of your research that you talked about, we were talking about ways to kind of date an area based on the presence of what's there. And I wondered if there are ways to date an area that's younger, that hasn't yet evolved into sort of a barren kind of sand dune.
Mm-hmm.
Can you use the same techniques to date a younger forest or a younger other area?
Definitely, yeah. So it's easier when it's younger. Actually, you could use like things like dendrochronology. So trees store these records, and we can look back. We could take a tree core sample, and you can store like hundreds of years back, and so you can get like this really fine scale annual record of how old a landscape is based on how old the trees are. And then you can also pull other really information out of tree cores based on like the width of the tree core from every year. You can compare it to like temperature or hydrology records and understand different climate things that were going on while that tree was growing. And then radiocarbon dating actually has like a life of, you can't date anything really older than 50,000 years. 50,000 years. And so that dates, I know that's not like, that sounds old, but like a geologist thinks that's really young. So those are kind of like younger landscapes.
Interesting. And so we talked a lot about the interdisciplinary work and all the different techniques that you use. So as a geomorphologist, I'm wondering, do you use a lot of those techniques all the time depending on the project? Or are there geomorphologists that specify in certain techniques and choose projects based on their specialty?
Definitely, yeah. So yeah, there's so many different things you could specialize in. I think a lot of people do kind of like pick one route, and for me, like depending on what job I've had at certain points in my career, I've specified certain things. I've worked a lot in environmental remediation and restoration work. I've done a lot of hydrology, and then in grad school, I kind of went in a different direction. I looked more at like wind, sand dunes and winds and this older paleoclimate research. That was just something that I always thought was really interesting. So yeah, I could go either way. Yeah, you could, work on really, I think habitat restoration is very interdisciplinary. Like that's one of the most interdisciplinary things that I've done. And that is like, working on those types of projects is what made me decide to, geomorphology was one class that I took as an undergrad in geology. And then working in those types of fields where you're integrating all these different principles to remediate watersheds and habitats. That was like really what made me want to go back to school and study geomorphology in grad school.
Interesting. So Kerri, where would you like to go with your future research?
Oh, I don't know. There's so many, there's so many good questions out there. Just making this presentation, I was like, man, I don't even know the answers to all these questions I'm setting up. So yeah, personally, I definitely am interested in water and climate. So those are two things that I think they're really important, and understanding, how water resources are going to change in the future is super important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be a fascinating study, especially as the world continues to change.
Yeah.
So it sounds like geomorphology might be a good career fit for a student who wants to do a lot of different techniques and have a lot of diversity in their career. And I'm wondering if there is a student watching who's interested in going into the field, what educational path would you recommend for them?
Yeah, so there's definitely different ones. Geomorphology is, based out of, like as an undergrad, you would definitely get your undergrad degree in geology, geoscience, geography, any of those sciences, and then take geomorphology classes. And then even my master's degree was a master's of geoscience with a focus in geomorphology. And so there's not a lot of like geomorphology degrees out there because they're so integrative and so interdisciplinary. And so you could, do these types of things with a background in environmental science, in natural resource management, and whatever field that you specialize in, always, make sure to just take a step back and think about, the whole systems approach, like how the entire landscape comes together to interact, and what that means for your research question or what you're trying to do.
I think that's great advice, to look at the specifics, but also to keep the big picture in mind. So I really appreciate your advice, Kerri, for our budding students. And it was so great to have you give this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.